I want to tell you something that I've never actually said out loud to anyone outside of a closed-room debrief. Not because I wasn't allowed to, but because every time I tried, my throat would tighten and I'd get this strange, hollow feeling behind my sternum, like the memory was too heavy to carry into casual conversation. Like saying it out loud at a dinner table would be wrong somehow. Disrespectful to what happened, to what she did. So I kept it inside for 3 years. But it needs to be told now, because people talk about soldiers, real ones, and most of the time they get it completely wrong. They imagine something from a movie, slow motion, epic music, heroism that looks clean and deliberate and rehearsed. It wasn't like that. None of it was like that. The morning it happened, I was sitting in the back of a dust-caked Humvee with a thermal flask of cold coffee. Because yes, even in that kind of heat, the coffee went cold fast, and I was reviewing grid coordinates on a laminated map that had already been folded and unfolded so many times the creases were turning white. The location was a stretch of terrain in northern Kunar province, Afghanistan. Near a ridgeline the locals had a name for that none of us could pronounce correctly. We'd been calling it the Shelf, among ourselves because from the aerial photos, that's exactly what it looked like. A long flat lip of rock jutting out from the mountain face, overlooking a valley below where 2 small villages sat maybe 400 meters apart. Our convoy was moving through that valley. 41 personnel, 2 interpreter teams, a medical unit, and a forward element of operators from a joint task force that I was technically embedded with as a senior intelligence advisor. I wasn't a trigger puller, I want to be clear about that. I carried a sidearm, I knew how to use it, but my job was information, reading signals, analyzing patterns, telling people what I thought was coming before it arrived. That morning, I thought something was wrong before I could say exactly why. Call it pattern recognition. Call it professional paranoia. I'd been doing this long enough that when a place that should feel dangerous starts feeling too quiet, your gut starts talking louder than your briefing notes. The valley had gone silent in a particular way. Not peaceful silent, not mourning silent. The kind of silence that happens when everything with instincts has already made a decision and cleared out. No birds, no distant goat bells, not even wind. I leaned forward and said to the SEAL commander sitting in the front passenger seat, a man named Commander Dax Rourke, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something geological. I said, "Dax, you feel that?" He didn't even turn around. He just said, "Yeah." One word, he'd felt it too. Rourke had been running special operations in that region for longer than most people's marriages lasted. He'd seen things that stripped the color from a man's face and left him quieter forever after. And when Dax Rourke said "yeah" in that flat, compressed tone, you understood immediately that the situation had just changed categories. He got on the radio. What I didn't know at the time, what I only pieced together later from the debrief transcripts and one long, raw conversation with the operator herself, was that approximately 90 minutes before our convoy entered that valley, a 7-man sniper cell had moved into position along the shelf. 7. That's not a coincidence. That's not opportunistic. 7 trained shooters setting up overlapping fields of fire across a valley approach is a coordinated ambush. Someone had fed them our route. Someone had given them our timeline. And they had arranged themselves with enough precision that any standard counter-sniper response would have taken far longer than we had. Each shooter was separated by roughly 40 to 60 meters, staggered elevation, each one covering a different kill zone in the convoy corridor. If the first shot had dropped on us when we were halfway through the valley, when there was no cover on either side and the road narrowed between 2 rock formations, the math on survival for 41 personnel would have gotten very ugly, very fast. Standard doctrine in a sniper ambush of that configuration. You return fire, you take cover, you call in air support, and you pray the QRF gets to you before the numbers run out. That process, even in ideal conditions, takes 25 to 40 minutes minimum. We didn't have 25 minutes. We might have had 8, maybe 10. I found out all of this later. While it was unfolding, I only knew what Rourke knew, which at that point was elevated threat, possible contact, convoy halting for assessment. He got back on the radio and said something I've never forgotten. His voice was calm, genuinely calm, the way only certain people can be calm, not because they're hiding fear, but because the fear has been so thoroughly processed over so many years that it no longer interferes with function. He said, "We have a 7-point sniper configuration on the high ground. They're dug in, they're staggered, and they have us bracketed. Standard interdiction won't reach them before first contact. I'm telling you now, you can't stop those snipers. Not from where we're sitting. Not in time." He said it straight. No drama, just the truth laid flat on the table. The silence that followed on that radio channel lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then a voice came back. Female, low, unhurried. She said, "Copy that, I'm already moving." Her name was Warrant Officer Elena Vasquez. I use her name now because she's allowed me to. Because she's moved on to other things, because enough time has passed, and because she told me once, sitting across from me in a hospital cafeteria in Bagram, while she was eating a cup of instant noodles with the focus of someone defusing a bomb, that she didn't want the story buried. She wanted it true. So I'm going to try to tell it true. Elena was 29 years old that morning. She'd grown up in a small town in New Mexico that she described as the kind of place where everyone leaves or everyone stays, and staying requires a very specific type of stubbornness. She had joined the army at 18, not because of any dramatic patriotic moment, not because of September 11, though that was in the atmosphere of everything back then. She joined because she was precise by nature, and the military offered her a structured world where precision was valued rather than weird. She told me that once. She said, "I'm not a people person, I'm a problem person. The army gives you real problems with actual solutions. That worked for me." She'd qualified as a markswoman with scores that had caused some quiet administrative confusion, because the range officers weren't sure which column of the scoring sheet to put her numbers in. She'd been fast-tracked through advanced training, cross-trained with elements that I won't name specifically, and by the time she ended up in Kunar province that autumn, she had been in-country for 11 months and had the kind of focused, weathered competence that you usually only see in people who have been doing a thing for 20 years. 11 months, 29 years old. She was positioned roughly 1,100 meters from the western end of the shelf. She'd been there since before dawn. Here is what I didn't understand until later, and this is the part that changes how you think about everything that came after. Elena had flagged the shelf 3 days earlier. She'd been reviewing reconnaissance imagery and cross-referencing local movement reports, and she'd noticed a pattern. Small things. A shepherd who always moved his flock through the eastern pass but hadn't appeared in 48 hours. Tire impressions on a service track that led toward the high ground and didn't have corresponding return impressions. A thermal anomaly in one of the early morning satellite passes that was too regular to be an animal and too still to be a person going about ordinary business. She'd written it up, submitted it. It had moved through channels. It had been assessed. And somewhere in the bureaucratic gap between assessed and acted upon, the convoy's route hadn't changed. I want to be careful here. I'm not pointing fingers. These things happen. Information is imperfect, timelines are tight, decisions get made with incomplete pictures. It's nobody's great failure. It's just the nature of the work. But Elena knew. She'd known for 3 days that the shelf was wrong. And when the convoy was confirmed and the route wasn't altered, she made a decision on her own, quietly, without announcement, to put herself into position before dawn on the day of movement. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't brief it widely. She told her spotter, a young sergeant named Cobb whom she trusted completely, and she told her immediate team leader in a brief, factual way that left no room for argument. Then she moved into position in darkness, in silence on her own timeline, carrying everything she needed. She'd been lying in that position for 4 hours when the sniper cell arrived on the shelf. She watched them set up. She counted them, mapped their positions, measured their separations, observed their communication patterns and their posture discipline and the direction of their range finders. And then she'd gotten on the radio and reported it in clean, clinical language that made Rourke's stomach drop when he heard it. 7 shooters, confirmed, coordinated, ready. And Rourke, being Rourke, had said the honest thing. You can't stop those snipers. He meant it. He believed it. From the perspective of every tactical option available to the convoy, to the quick reaction force, to the air assets that were 20 minutes out, he was right. He just hadn't fully accounted for the person who was already there. Let me try to describe what it was like up there. I've never been in that exact position, physically, I mean. But Sergeant Cobb described it to me in detail during the debrief, and Alina filled in the rest later in that cafeteria conversation. Between the two of them, I can build the picture clearly enough that it sits in my mind like something I actually witnessed. The ground was loose shale over packed clay, the kind of surface that shifts slightly when weight is applied and makes a sound, not loud but present, if you don't move with absolute deliberateness. The temperature at 4:30 when they'd settled in was 11 degrees Celsius. By the time the sniper cell arrived at 6:20, it had dropped to 9. The wind was coming in irregular pulses from the northeast, which matters enormously when you're calculating bullet travel over distances greater than 800 meters, because irregular wind means you're never working with a fixed number. You're constantly reading, constantly adjusting, constantly committing to a calculation that might shift in the half-second between trigger press and impact. There was a rock formation to Alina's left, a natural shelf within the shelf, if that makes sense, that had been her reference point for positioning. She'd lain behind it at an angle that gave her a clear sightline to the main body of the enemy position, while keeping her profile below the ridgeline as seen from the valley floor. Cobb was 4 meters to her right, slightly lower, with the spotting scope. They communicated almost entirely in whispers, not radio whispers, actual whispers, barely breath level, because sound carries strangely in mountain terrain, and they were close enough to the enemy position that any unusual acoustic signature could have turned the whole situation around. What Alina had going for her, and I think this is the part people skip over when they tell this story in a more abbreviated way, was not just skill, it was preparation. She had done the work that nobody asked her to do, gotten into position nobody told her to get into, and spent 4 hours doing nothing but observing and thinking and solving the problem before the problem officially existed. By the time Rourke made his assessment over the radio, Alina had already decided on her sequence. She knew which shooter she was engaging first. She knew the order after that. She'd mapped the dead ground between them, the places where a surviving shooter might move for cover, and had pre-calculated the adjustments she'd need to make as the wind shifted through the morning hours. She had built the whole thing in her head, like architecture. And then she waited for the right moment. Cobb told me that the first thing he remembers thinking when it started was that he almost missed it. Not because he wasn't watching, because it was so controlled, so completely without drama that his brain almost filed it in the normal category for a split second before the data caught up. He said there was a sound, just one, and then the scope picture changed. He was watching the position of the first shooter through the spotting scope. The man had been motionless, good discipline. He'd give him that, oriented toward the valley, waiting for his trigger. And then he wasn't there anymore. Not in any spectacular way. He just stopped being a presence in the scope picture. One moment occupied, the next moment not. Cobb called the hit in a whisper. Alina said nothing. She was already moving, not her body. She didn't move her body, but her attention, her scope, her breathing. Her entire internal architecture was already rotating toward position 2. The second shooter was separated from the first by roughly 50 meters and a slight change in elevation. He was 4 feet higher, tucked against a boulder that gave him good cover from the valley side but left a narrow exposure angle from Alina's position. Narrow but present. She'd identified it during her observation window and had noted the exact geometry. The gap between the first shot and the second was approximately 40 seconds. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 40 seconds. That's not a frantic, adrenaline-hammered sequence. That's measured. That's someone making deliberate decisions under conditions that would cause most people's hands to shake so badly they couldn't hold a cup of water steady. The second shot connected. Cobb called it. Now here is where it gets complicated, and I want to be honest about this because the sanitized version of the story skips it completely. After the second shot, the cell reacted. They weren't amateurs. They were trained fighters who understood immediately that something was wrong. Someone on their flank had a position. 2 of their people were down and they hadn't heard the origin of the fire, which told them the shooter was far away, well suppressed, and elevated above their own level. That last detail was the critical one. Being shot at from the same elevation or below is manageable. You go prone, you find cover, you suppress the origin point. Being shot at from above and behind your position is a different category of problem entirely. 2 of the remaining 5 moved. 1 went right, toward a cluster of boulders that offered overhead cover. 1 went left, dropping below the ridgeline into a shallow depression that cut along the top of the shelf. The other 3 went flat and stayed flat. Cobb tracked the movement, calling it clean and fast, his voice so steady I almost can't believe it when I read the transcript. He said later that during those seconds he wasn't thinking about anything except the task of giving Alina clean information. He wasn't processing fear. He wasn't processing the scale of what was happening. He was just watching and talking. He said that's what training does. It gives you a thing to do so completely that there's no mental space left for the things that would slow you down. Alina tracked the runner to the right. He'd gone to cover, but the boulder cluster had a gap, a natural channel between 2 of the rocks, and he'd positioned himself facing downhill, which meant his back was toward Alina. She waited. He shifted. The gap opened by about 15 degrees. She put the third shot through it. The one who'd gone left, down into the depression, was harder. Cobb lost visual on him for almost 90 seconds. He was calling the depression, giving Alina an approximate last known and an estimated direction of movement. But the geometry of the terrain meant there was a dead zone, a stretch of maybe 20 meters, where the depression dipped below the line of sight, even from Alina's elevated position. Those 90 seconds are the part of the story that she talked about most in that cafeteria, not the shots, the 90 seconds. She said, the waiting is where everything either holds together or falls apart, because your brain wants to panic solve. It wants to find a shortcut, and a shortcut in that situation gets you or gets Cobb or gets 41 people in the valley below. She didn't shortcut. She waited. She breathed. She watched the exit points from the depression, the 2 places where he could re-emerge based on the terrain, and she built a picture of which one he'd choose based on where he'd last been going and what the natural path of movement looked like from that depression. She picked the left exit. He came out of the right one. She was already adjusting before Cobb finished the call, tracking, settling. The 4th shot came 11 seconds after he reappeared. By this point, the convoy below had stopped completely. I remember this part from my own perspective, which I realize I've been absent from for a while. Sorry. I got so deep into reconstructing what was happening on the shelf that I lost the thread of what I was personally experiencing. We were stopped on the road. The vehicles had pulled into a modified herringbone, angled in opposite directions to maximize the field of fire on either side, and the operators were out and in position. Everyone was tense. Rourke was on the radio in a continuous loop, pulling updates from assets and pushing information to the task force command. And then something started happening that took me a minute to understand. The radio traffic from the shelf was ticking. Not screaming, not panicking, just ticking. Clean, methodical reports from Cobb, short sentences, numbers, directions, confirmation calls. And then, between those calls, something that I can only describe as a kind of professional quiet that has its own quality. When you're listening to someone work who is completely inside the problem, completely on top of it, and performing at a level that doesn't leave room for noise. Rourke heard it before I understood what I was hearing. I saw his shoulders change, just slightly. The set of something loosening very marginally, the way a door swings on well-oiled hinges, barely perceptible but present. He looked at the radio like it was telling him something he hadn't expected. And then he looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The fifth and sixth shots happened within a window of approximately 4 minutes. The three who'd gone flat had been making small movements, adjusting position, trying to find angles from which they could identify and suppress the threat on their flank. But flat is not invisible, and movement is never fully suppressible, and Alina had been watching each of them with the patience of someone who has learned, really learned, in the deepest way, that patience is not passive. Patience is a form of violence deployed at the right moment. She took the fifth from a shooter who'd crawled 7 meters to his right, and in doing so had exposed his left side to a 3-second window. Cobb caught the movement, called it. Alina sent the shot through the window with 1 second remaining. The sixth was the one who made a decision. You could almost feel it happening even from a distance. Cobb said to stand up and run. Just break contact and run, because staying flat wasn't working and the alternatives were narrowing. He got to his feet. He made it 4 strides. That was the sixth. 7 remained. 1. The last one. He hadn't moved. Through all of it, through 6 shots, through his entire cell being systematically removed around him, he had not moved. He'd stayed flat, pressed into the rock, making himself as small as possible and staying that way. Cobb couldn't get a clean read on him. He was in good cover. He'd chosen well, either by training or by instinct, and he'd executed a decision that is actually the correct one in that situation: stay still, stay hidden, wait for the threat to relocate or run out of options. It's the right call. It's just that it required him to assume the shooter had limited patience and limited time. He didn't know Alina. She waited him out. 13 minutes. That's how long she held position after the 6th shot. 13 minutes of complete stillness, watching the last remaining position through a scope with her breathing under such control that Cobb said he could barely see her back moving. 13 minutes. And then the man made one mistake. He turned his head. Just that, just enough to look toward where his nearest colleague had been, maybe checking, maybe hopping, maybe just the unbearable human need to see, to know what had happened. His face turned 4 inches toward Alina's position. She was already on it. The 7th shot ended the ambush.